Good afternoon. Our next speaker is Mr. Gaurav Aggarwal, who is the principal architect with Microsoft. He has over 18 years of experience, IT experience, and his current role he provides consulting to Microsoft partners and to customers on establishing cloud strategies. He's going to speak to us today on persona-based cloud. I will hand over the podium to Gaurav.
Thanks, Durga, for introduction and opportunity. And good afternoon, everyone. And this is probably the right setting after Lux's session, where he has already spoken about what cloud has to offer and the transformation journey. But I'm going to bring in a completely a different perspective to this technology view, because most of the time when we are talking about cloud, people think about technology perspective. People use jargons like infrastructure as a service, private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud. Now, what I'm going to do in next 20-25 minutes is to bring another perspective that if you are a partner trying to establish cloud services, or if you are internal IT folks, other than the technology, how you should be thinking about or planning about to bring in a better business value. And the closest analogy that you could relate it to across this entire session is that people have been saying, if you think about business applications is what drives better value returns or ROIs, instead of just thinking about technology. So I'm just bringing in a concept here. I would talk very less about any of those technical jargon. It's just a simple concept that when you're thinking about cloud or a journey towards cloud, another perspective that you could consider, and that's what I'm referring as a persona-based cloud. But just to set the perspective there, so I will not spend much time because most of you are already aware of IT trends. Cloud computing is one of them, and from that other perspective is we are talking about natural user interface, or for that matter, people are talking about ecosystem of computers. Now, instead of spending a lot of time on cloud IT trends and things like this, the point is what are the expectations that end users or the business users in an organization has from IT. Instead of looking at a list, what I'm showing you here is what end result means. Now, what people are asking for is, why should, as an end user, I adapt to your systems? Why can't IT adapt the way I work? So it's more about adapting to the usage profiles of users. Second thing is, why are you slowing me down? People keep on saying, I want a faster computer. Why so much of buzz around that? Why can't I get a faster computer, more CPU power, more RAM? But what effectively user is saying, why are you slowing me down? He doesn't care about whether it's a new hardware, old hardware. If he can perform his work in the given time frame, that's what he's bothering about. Now give me access to my data from anywhere. I need a full access to the data that I need to deliver my business, that I need to do my day-to-day job. Then another thing that we're talking about is work culture changes. Now that's a key point, that because typically if you look at in any industry, you will always have a high ratio of people leaving and joining. Now, how about establishing a perspective where you're saying, I can reduce the onboarding time for any worker who joins new. And the way you could do that is, cloud could be one way where you're establishing all your application over the cloud, but if that cloud is seamless in terms of services that you offer. So if you look at, for example, a retail as a vertical, instead of saying private cloud for myself, what about a cloud which caters to a lot of user personas or profiles for retail? Cloud which caters to a lot of user profiles for insurance vertical. So we are trying to look at persona-based cloud where you could drive those business applications which are focused towards user profiles. So if you are looking at multiple insurance organizations, the learning time for those applications or onboarding new users is much, much more lesser. Then other thing that we are talking about is, can you give me what I need in terms of evolve, be relevant? How do I do that business innovation? The last step that Lux talked about, that can I do business innovation based on whatever services I'm offering to or getting used to? Now, based on this, typically what CIO is looking at. CIO is dealing with three things. And what cloud is doing? Now, he's more responsible, he or she is more responsible to strike a right balance between cost and control. Because we will just keep on talking about cloud will help you in saving the cost, but it is impacting hugely on the processes that an organization would have defined over a period of time. And be in terms of regulatory compliances, be it in terms of the governance processes that you would establish, or B, in terms of the disaster recovery or business continuity services plan that organization would have defined. What cloud is doing is it's impacting all of those. So now you have to strike a balance, how much cost I'm going to incur to onboard the cloud journey, plus how much time and money I need to incur to redefine those processes, governance steps, that whatever you have defined. And you have to strike a right balance as a CIO between cost and the control, because some of the regulatory compliances still are being a challenge for any cloud provider. Let's step back and look at why we want to talk about personas. Typically, 9 to 5 office hours, what are we looking at? There are times when you are starting up a day, then you go a little active, then coffee breaks, tea breaks, lunch, and then in a typical day of 9 to 5, what are we doing as a key activities? If I look at activity view, then you are performing what we do. Typically, a knowledge worker, what it is doing, you start your day by reading few emails, then you look at few meetings, phone calls, and what is the output of phone calls and meetings? You read more emails and analyze data. That's what we are doing day in, day out. This other activities definitely are there which you are delivering to your organization, but I've picked a few which relates very well to the concept that I want to talk about. Now, if we are talking about this, now this is cutting across different industries. It's not very specific to IT, or it's not specific to any vertical. It's cutting across. Now, if we could identify that there are patterns like this, then why we are just thinking about technical challenges to establish cloud? Think a little differently, and that's what I want to talk about. That from a knowledge worker perspective, this is another thought which is related to this, that what we want to achieve. We are saying there are physical workers and there are knowledge workers. And what is the objective of our organization? Do you want to increase physical work, or do you want to ensure knowledge works? And from that perspective, I've divided it into 4 quadrants by bringing in linear thinking and non-linear thinking to it. Now, what effectively we want to achieve is a perspective wherein your knowledge worker is spending more time in creating and processing. So the whole perspective of establishing whether non-cloud existing traditional ways or over cloud, you want to achieve that people spend more time in creating and processing. And if you establish patterns around it, I want to show you, I'm sure at the back chart is not visible, but the key point here is that if you look at by roles, there are data available which says how different roles or profiles from a labor department perspective are going to grow over a period of time. And there are clear indications that there are few roles which are going to grow much more drastically, like 50% growth over a period of 2000 to 2018. So it's comparatively a old study, but still relevant. And IT has been highlighted there, and the other one which shows 50% is around personal and home care stuff. So if you're saying there are ways in which we could standardize that how different profiles are going to increase inside organization, that could be another way to think about when you're thinking about your cloud strategy. A split of that same chart, we are saying by job function, as per that study, what it says is there are going to be a huge amount of growth, almost 35% growth of specialists which are vertical specific specialization. Another thing is administrative support. So we are seeing a clear pattern from different labor department studies and surveys that this kind of roles are going to increase much faster in terms of number of people playing that role vis-a-vis the other roles. Now, other thing is, if I split that by industry, then what we are seeing is government and education and retails are increasing much more differently as compared to the other verticals. Now, if this data is also being relevant, and especially for service providers or small ISV who wants to build a lot of solution, you could use and pick what persona-based clouds with vertical focus that you want to build onto. And from a Microsoft perspective, this is how we think about different personas. Names might be different from different organizations, but more or less this is how you could classify the entire audience inside our organization or an enterprise. That you would have some task workers, you would have some office workers who more or less works out of the office. Then you have mobile workers, typically your sales or the field force. Then you have people who work from home, and then you have contractors. If you divide our enterprise into 5 different personas, then looking at what they do in a typical day, we could establish service-driven things for those personas. And the advantage of doing that is then you are relevant to much more verticals, much more enterprises. You are not struggling and saying, I can provide you a messaging service, which is a very small part of any of the personas, or I can provide you CRM on the cloud, which is again a small part. So, because typically when you go to a CIO or CEO today, they are not saying solve my messaging problem or solve my security problem. What they're saying is this is how I run my business. Can you increase my business revenue, or can you help me in reducing the cost? Go and give me a business solution end to end. And if that is the case, persona-based cloud services collaboration can give you that perspective. Let's look at how does this different workers, profiles or personas work. Again, a little bit busy chart, but what I've done here is that based on Microsoft study and IDC study, what typically these personas are performing. So what they are performing here is that how much time they're spending on internet, emails, phone, data analysis, right from playing with meetings, planning, or document creation. So all these columns are exactly same, but based on different personas, how much time in a day they are spending is this chart trying to show. And if you look at out of this, typically people have been focusing about, okay, I can solve the messaging problem on the cloud. I can solve something else on the cloud. But what we are saying is pick up a persona and try to solve that entire set of services that persona requires. To click a little bit more on the task persona, typically from a work style perspective, how predictable they are from a low to high. Typically their work style is pretty much predictable. They are less mobile, and time dependencies are very high in terms and place dependencies. Now what I'm trying to establish here is that how do you identify these personas and how much things are common between those personas across organizations. Similarly, from an information handling perspective, they are most of the time dealing with the classified data, and probably they are consuming or creating something which is pretty much less, but they are spending very less time towards the office environment. Similar patterns for office workers. From an office worker perspective, again, predictability is very high, place dependency is also very high. Now, what this kind of establishment gives you is that you could look at technical perspective of private cloud and public cloud and hybrid cloud and come up with a persona-based cloud, which could be again a mix of where you are hosting those services. And I will show you a couple of charts around those, how those different services based on personas could go to private, public or hybrid clouds. Similarly, from an information handling perspective, key point to note here is most of the time they want to deal with real-time data. People who are sitting in office, they are most of the time probably spending a lot of time on line of business application, analytics, so they want to look at the real-time data, the way it is happening. Let's look at other profile, which is about mobile personas. Now, these users are not that predictable because you can't predict their working style. Place dependency is very low because that's by nature we are saying they are mobile workers, they would like to work from anywhere. In terms of information handling, they are dealing with office environments, but they are trying to create that office environment accessibility from anywhere. Similar perspective for work at home. We think they are more predictable, time dependencies are high, place dependencies are high. Now what does it mean is that you need to provide applications which could cater to that kind of work style, which is completely different than a mobile persona or a task persona. So if you're looking at solving a messaging problem for a task persona versus a home worker, it's completely a different game. From an information handling perspective, they are dealing with a lot of classified data. So the security problem or your data related issues completely needs to be handled differently. They might be dealing with line of business systems also very heavily. Contract workers. Today, every enterprise you will go, you will always find a lot of contract workers. And from a work style perspective, they are not that predictable, but they like to have a very high mobility. And place dependency is more or less not very high, not very low, because they might work out of your own premise or their service provider's premise. But then you need to still cater to scenarios where the applications are accessible to them inside your enterprise and outside enterprise. From an information handling perspective, they most of the time are not dealing with real-time data. Though there might be few contractors who have been hired just to do data analysis, some statistician roles, they might like to deal with real-time data, but I'm looking at generalizing it. From a generalization perspective, we don't see those people dealing with real-time data. Now with this all perspective, I want to bring in the IT view to it. Now typically what an IT platform includes? You got infrastructure, data layer, application, integration, and user experience. I'm keeping it very simple. There are multiple things which will cut across, but typically IT enterprise would look like this. Now if I look at those personas and look at what they would like to use, this is kind of where, though at the end it's not readable, I'll read it out for you. So what effectively we are talking about is the way they would like to access those applications. So if you look at across personas, the first one is about anywhere access, and typically a mobile persona would like to have anywhere access going for them. And then secure composite application is also very much relevant to work at home guys or the mobile personas. The key point here is that across personas, we could identify what kind of typical work style pattern, information handling patterns they are dealing with. Once we have identified for that enterprise, and typically these patterns are going to look very common within an industry vertical. Based on this kind of patterns, and if we could look at what from a vendor perspective, being a Microsoft employee, I've shown most of the things which is from Microsoft, but it could be any other corresponding product. The point here is that you would have a virtualized environment that's for given in a typical mature organization now, and you would have a lot of business apps, productivity, collaboration, communication, identity, device, database, and other platform. Let's forget about the product names because that's very much Microsoft specific. I don't want to spend time on it. But overall classification would look like more or less in terms of that. Now, if we move that further and try to establish how does on the cloud different offerings look like. Again, I don't want to focus on product names, but what I want to talk about here is that people are talking about software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Now, within this, different service providers, different primary OEM vendors would have different product names. But typically, if I have to divide that, whatever virtualization and the traditional stuff, people are converting it to private cloud. Then what you see typically from a platform as a service perspective or cutting across, we are referring as public cloud, and anything in between, or if you talk about is hybrid cloud. Instead of spending time about definitions, what I want to do is, where we are saying how does a task cloud would look like for a task persona. Now typically a task persona would like to use applications which are highlighted. Now on this screen it doesn't show very clearly, but some of those boxes has gone gray and some of those are being highlighted. So what I'm trying to do here is that based on the IT capabilities that you got, now we got the different personas within that enterprise, and we are trying to map that if you want to establish a cloud perspective for task persona, what capabilities you would be looking at. And from that perspective, typically you would be looking at providing them access to applications which are relevant, and those would be that you need to have some identity solution, you need to provide them some sort of a application set that can access databases, and it could be any of those applications coming up from software as a service. Now what it does is that cutting across different user set, it is giving you a perspective that what options are available to you. Instead of just evaluating a software as a service for one particular capability, look at the entire persona, that this persona would need 20 capabilities. Now which service provider can give me maximum out of those? That will help you in reducing a heterogeneous vendor environments from a cloud perspective also. And that could also give you a huge business value because you are catering to an entire user set instead of a technical capability. Now from a standardization perspective, you could still pick up a technical capability and say across different personas, messaging is common from a common vendor. So you could do that kind of a rationalization, but from a service provider perspective, ISV perspective, or internal IT leadership perspective, this could give you a different way to think about it. The way you plan about your journey for cloud is technical perspective is whether you want to do private cloud, public or hybrid cloud. But from a line of business or business perspective, looking at personas and solving those problems for that persona will be a much better option to look at. Let's look at office cloud perspective. So typically a office persona would like to use applications which are falling more or less on the platform as a service perspective, because they would be dealing with a lot of line of business application. Either those has to be moved as an infrastructure as a service, or you would recreate those applications as platform as a service. But from a mobile persona perspective, a typical mobile persona cloud would look like where you're dealing again with a lot of software as a service providers can provide you that, because typically what mobile persona needs is anywhere access, with definitely from a security perspective, but still you would have few applications which are accessing line of business data which is sitting in your private cloud. That's a small perspective that we are trying to show there, that few applications still might see in platform as a service. Similarly, for work at home, again you would look at some of the things, and there we are again looking at some portal perspective which might be cutting across two different environments, because some of your applications still might not be in a position to be moved to the public cloud. So more or less it would be a heterogeneous environment which would look like a hybrid cloud. Contractor cloud would be cutting across more or less everything. Now if I have to summarize, because I saw that 5-minute stuff, sorry about that. So from a contractor cloud perspective, depending upon what a contractor profile does in an enterprise, it could actually cut across every service that you offer, except for some of your line of business application that you would not like to expose to them. If I have to put across everything into one single summary, though I have listed down some product names, but focus in this session is not to talk about product names. Focus is that across those personas, what capabilities you would look at. And the one message that I want to send out of this entire session is, in your cloud journey, think about user profiles, user personas, and try to solve problems for those user personas instead of small set of users. And the advantage would be that you'll be able to deliver the business value much faster. You could monetize it much faster if you want to go and become a service provider, or if you're an ISV, you could look at solving problems based on personas. And it's a pretty much a easier sell or a marketing pitch where you're saying, guys, I have established a cloud which could solve task worker and mobile worker for retail. Now it's an easier thing. Go to any retail customer and say, this is how I'm solving those 20 work profiles, 20 capabilities that your task worker and a mobile worker needs. And then it becomes much more relevant to business, much more relevant to CIO and line of business owner, instead of just trying to cater to a CIO. And in today's IT environment and ecosystem economics, it makes much more sense to connect to line of business owner or CEO instead of just relying on your relationship with a CIO. That's what I had as a message. I'm open to any questions. Yes.
What would be the difference between having role-based access management or the role-based deployment, or should we call this as another additional parameter to the roles which we exist? Like, say, for example, based on different departments, you can give different kind of services which you have. So along with the departments, if I go ahead and another give kind of the work profile of the user, right? So would that should this be fitting as an extra additional role parameter to the user based on which we would be giving services on the cloud?
So see, typically what we have been doing in enterprises is that you establish a service. Let's say, let's stick to messaging as a service, and then you provide role-based access or line of business application, and then you say, if you belong to internal IT, based on your role, you get to see 2 screens, but if you are a head of a department, you see every data. Or if you go to sales, based on your role, you see North India data or you see South India data. That still will remain. So we are saying the data access is still based on roles, but look at another generalization. So irrespective of your role, you needed a messaging service, and typically if your work profile is you are a mobile persona, you still would need access to the data which is relevant to you, but there are set of work patterns and information handling patterns. So I'm saying generalize that when you're onboarding a journey of cloud. Instead of establishing a messaging service on the cloud and say it would cut across all the personas And then you will get into how would you use those role-based access to ensure that who gets 5 MB mailbox and who gets a 100 MB mailbox based on the role profile. That's a smaller myopic view. I'm saying look at that a mobile worker, because typically for whom you have positioned a messaging, if he happens to be a mobile profile, he would need 10 additional services, which you are not offering on cloud.
But don't you see a little challenge here in before setting up this particular kind of a cloud, I should have a basic usage pattern among all the
Yes.
users, right? So wouldn't that, like say for example, like say for example, I'm a customer who is trying to buy this particular type of a solution, persona-based cloud solution.
Yes.
Then there would definitely be a delay for me in first establishing a normal solution, then studying the usage pattern, and then moving to a persona-based.
Okay, very good question. So typically what would happen is that any organization that you will enter into, they would have profiled their users into some groups or categories. They might not match exactly the 5 personas that I spoke about, but more or less in our study, or when I am dealing with a lot of customers across, we have seen either 4 or 6 categories of users that enterprise talks about. And if you could cater to those 4 or 6 personas, then they start connecting much easier and much faster. But I have not seen customer where they was not able to talk about a classification for their employee base. Names might be different, they will classify there are mobile workers, or instead of calling them as mobile workers, they would always say they are the field guys. Now what a field guy is, that would be very close to a mobile profile. Then they will say there are a lot of contractors or outsourcers. So if somebody says I have a call center outsourced to somebody, what are those? Those are contractors. Or they are task workers if they happens to be the employee also. So they might use a different name, but more or less you will be able to establish that categorization in most of the organizations. Any other questions? Fine, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Mr. Aggarwal, and a small token from UBM.